Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the 2024-25 end of year pension process webinar, where we will be discussing the Type 2 self-assessment forms. My name is Debbie Roberts and I will be helping facilitate this evening's session. Okay, so just to let you know who we've got on the call today. So we have Katrina Veneris, who's the PCSE Senior Stakeholder Relationship Manager, and Katrina will be going through various slides with you. And then from the communications team at PCSE, you've got myself and my colleague Kat supporting in the background. So looking at the contents for the evening, so we're going to start off with a video that's explaining what the end of year form is and who needs to complete the form. We'll be having a look at the employee contribution statement, what's available in PCSE Online. We'll then be having a look at completing the Type 2 form in PCSE Online, so we've got a bit of a system demonstration on that for you. We'll then be going through looking at how you can calculate the correct tier rate, and then what to do if there are any under or over payments. It shows questions at the end there, but like I say, we will be pausing throughout the session to answer your questions live. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with the end of year forms and just explaining what they are and who needs to complete them. Type 2 self-assessment forms are to be completed every year by Type 2 medical practitioners who are members of the NHS pension scheme. The 2024-25 Type 2 self-assessment form must be completed by Type 2 medical practitioners who are members of the NHS GP pension scheme between the 1st of April 2024 and the 31st of March 2025. So why do you need to complete a Type 2 self-assessment form? It ensures the correct tiered rate contributions have been applied to your salaried GP earnings. It ensures that the amount you are due to pay for your tiered rate and any added years or additional pension contributions has been identified, and shortfalls or refunds can then be dealt with by you and your employers. It also ensures that PCSE have the correct information about your total pensionable earnings, so they can ensure the correct amount is paid over by your employers. So who completes the Type 2 form? A salaried GP that's just been working in a practice will need to complete the Type 2 form. A salaried GP who's also been completing solo work will need to complete the Type 2 form. If you're a salaried GP and have been completing locum work, you'll need to complete the Type 2 form. And if you're a salaried GP that's been completing solo and locum work, you'll also complete the Type 2 form. GPs that have just completed solo work will also need to complete the Type 2 form, along with GPs that have completed both solo and locum work. Solely locum GPs should not complete a Type 2 form. Solo work might be work for an out-of-hours provider, a clinical lead, or a board member for an ICB, or alternatively, you may have been an appraiser for the NHS England region. Locum work will only be included if you have pensioned the work by submitting locum A and B forms within the required 10-week timeframe and have paid the relevant payments. As a locum GP, it's your decision whether you wish to pension your locum work. But remember, solely locum GPs should not complete a Type 2 form, as there is no requirement to do so. If a GP has changed roles throughout the pension year, for example, being a partner GP, then moved to a salaried position, then you'll need to complete both the Type 1 and Type 2 forms in order to cover both roles. You must only include practitioner income on your Type 2 form. If you had an officer role, this will have been pensioned directly by your employer and must not be included on your Type 2 form. If you are unsure if your work is classed as practitioner or officer in the pension scheme, the provider you work at should be able to advise you. Work carried out for an independent provider employing authority cannot be pensioned as practitioner. Further guidance about what pay is actually pensionable is available on the NHS Pensions and BMA website. Okay, so we're just going to now go to questions. So I'm going to hand you over to Katrina to see if any questions have come through about who completes the Type 2 form. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Just having a look at the early questions, Debbie. Some questions about some of the technicalities of the rules and how money is earned. So one, for example, about earnings through a limited company. So there are restrictions and limitations on depending on how you're paid, whether you can include those earnings for pensionable purposes. So for questions such as that, then the NHS Pensions website has a very good comprehensive GP pensions guide, and it also has some detailed examples of the different types of work and scenarios that some of the GPs have or undertake. So that's where we would request that you go to for that clarification. A couple of questions really asking about solo work, and we get a lot of questions about that, and it's just a term that, it's a bit meaningless really, to be honest. It's something that appeared in pensions sort of language and land quite some time ago now, but it's very difficult to define. The video that Debbie showed covered the three main types of solo work. So the three main types are if a GP is, already salaried or a partner and then works as an appraiser for an NHS England region, then that, under the pensions rules, is pensioned as solo earnings. There are also ICB roles such as clinical leads and board members, that if there is a contract for service, so if the GP works under a contract for service, then that's classed as solo work. If a GP works under a contract of service, that's classed as officer work, so isn't pensioned via PCSE and isn't included on a type 2 form. The other category is out of hours extended access type providers, that a lot of that is pensioned as solo. There's a specific question about NHS 111 work. Now, some of the NHS 111 contracts, the GPs are pensioned as solo and some aren't. So the best thing to do in that instance, if you're not sure, is to speak to the provider you're working for, so the HR department, I guess, and they will know whether they're paying contributions directly with all of the other staff members to NHS pensions, which means they're treating it as officer, or if they are actually sending solo data across every month to the ICB for them to then upload through the PCSE systems, which is how the solo practitioner contributions get in these days. So I think that's the key ones, and just one more to pick up on this, and we can come back to some of the topics. But if you have changed employer and so you've had two salaried roles in the year, then the type 2 form has multiple rows for salaried roles. Goodness, can't speak this evening. So you would have 2 rows to complete, and if your employment was continuous, we'll get on to annualisation a little bit later on, but if you finished at one role on the 31st of the month and started at the other one the 1st of the next month, you've got continuous pensionable employment, but you've obviously got a limited period in each role, but they both get included on that single type 2 form. So I think that is probably where we want to move on to the next video, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're now going to cover the employee contribution statement, which is available in PCSE Online, but this will just show you a lot more detail and give you a little bit of more insight around it. A useful resource for completing your end-of-year form is your employee contribution statement that can be found within your PCSE Online account. Your employee contribution statement shows all the pension contributions PCSE have on record for you. This will include contributions for solo and locum work, as well as deductions from the practice or practices at which you were a salaried GP. To find your employee contribution statement, you will need to log into your PCSE Online account, which can be accessed from the PCSE website by selecting PCSE Online Login at the top of the page. Sign into your account by adding your username, password, and selecting Sign In. Your username will be your email address. If you have forgotten any of your details, you can select the Forgotten Your Login Details button, which is under the green Sign In tab. If selected, you will then be prompted with a screen that gives you different options to regain access to your account. For example, as you can see, if you have forgotten your password, all you need to do is enter your username and select Reset Password. You will then receive an email with the instructions on how to reset your password. If you don't receive the email, please check the email address you have entered. It's the same email address used to originally set up your account. You should also check the junk or spam folder for the email. When you have logged into your account, you can proceed to locate your employee contribution statement by selecting the green tab that says GP Pensions and Payments. Then select the Pensions tab. And then Employee Contribution Statement. You will then be presented with the Employee Contributions Statement search screen, and you'll notice that the personal details in the highlighted section will auto-populate. To find the relevant Employee Contribution Statement, you'll need to select your required pension year. Here, I am searching for the 2024-25 financial year. You can click Search to see all of the contributions for the year, or select by income type before clicking Search if you have multiple roles. Here, I am searching for monthly salary. You can also select your practice if you have worked at more than one practice. You do not need to select pension scheme type for 2024-25, as all members have been in the 2015 scheme since the 1st of April 2022. The Select Practices drop-down is where you will find the ODS code for the practice or solo provider you worked for. Here, you will find the ODS code you will need to submit your Type 2 form. The Employee Contribution Statement is a summary of the pension contributions that have been paid throughout the pension year by the practice. The payments on the statement are a reflection of the estimate of pensionable profit the practice has submitted on your behalf as a GP working at the practice. The purpose of the end-of-year form is to reconcile these payments to ensure the correct amount is sent to NHS pensions, ensuring your pension record is up to date. The practice will submit a revised estimate to PCSE each year with the estimated earnings for each GP working at the practice, and this also includes selecting their required tier rate. Payments are then deducted from the practice each month based on the details provided on the estimate form submitted by the practice. When you submit your end-of-year form, PCSE will reconcile the information you've declared on your end-of-year form against what has actually been paid and make the necessary adjustments with the practice. As you can see on this example employee contribution statement, it includes all details such as each month a payment has been made, the income type, the monthly income received, the employer and employee contributions, along with the selected tier rate. From this page, you will also have the option to print or download this information if you wish. Here we have another example of the employee contribution statement, this time showing both solo and locum earnings. If you wish to see the different types of earnings, you simply select the Income Type tab. If a practice you have worked at doesn't appear on the employee contribution statement, this would indicate that the practice haven't been paying monthly pension contributions on your behalf. There are various reasons why this may have happened. The first being you may not have logged into your PCSE online account and provided PCSE details of your employment change. Or you may have submitted an employment change, but the practice or ICB haven't completed the approval for it, meaning the request is still pending. Or your employment details are accurate, but the practice haven't submitted a pensions joiner form for you, so no pension contributions have been deducted from the practice for you as yet. You will need to head over to the Performer List section within PCSE Online and check which practice you are currently aligned to and make the necessary arrangements to ensure your employment details match where you are or have been working. More information around Performer List employment changes is available on the PCSE website within the Performer List resources section. Okay, so I'm going to pause for another 5 minutes, I think, something like that, just to see if there are any more questions that you want to run through, Katrina.
Thank you, Debbie. There's a lot of questions, some of it linking back to the earlier discussion that we've had. Just want to go back to the NHS 111 question. It might have been from somebody entirely different, but the angle this time is if it is confirmed that it's been pensioned through the officer route and this GP only has that role, doesn't have any other roles, then they need to do a type 2 form, and the answer to that's absolutely not. If it's only officer income, regardless of who that's done for, whether it's an academic role or any of the types of roles that might be pensioned as officer, then there are no practitioner roles, so the GP doesn't have to do a type 2 form. So that was one question. There's a question about if I've started partway through a pension year, started partway through 23-24, and I haven't actually done any type 2 forms yet, what do I need to do? So do I need to do 23-24 and 24-25? So the answer to that is yes. So even if it was, I think it was October 23 in example, then 23-24 form needs to be done retrospectively for that pension year, and then the 24-25 form is obviously available now. The question about the deadline, and clearly the initial deadline for the forms is normally the 28th of February. It will be the 28th of February in 26 for 24-25 forms. Get the years mixed up. But for people who have got a gap, whether it's 23-24 or an earlier year, then really they still need to be actioned. So, there's no, currently, NHS pensions don't deploy any penalty for, apart from your record not being up to date, of course, for not submitting the form on time. So really, the sooner you can get it in and it goes into the queue along with all of the current year's processing, and PCSE will process that in due course for you. So yes, they do need to be submitted. There's another question going back to different types of roles and employments that GPs might have. I think someone has 2 different organisations they do solo work for. I think it was out of hours maybe, and NHS England as an appraiser. The question there is, do they have to do 2 type 2 forms? So no, you don't. And it's similar to what I said if you were online when the question was about 2 different practice roles in the 1 year. They go on to the one form, the solo section, if you like. Row 3 is the first row for solo, and then there is a second row 4, if you've got a second solo role. So you would complete 1 type 2 form. You would have the different employers that you worked for should have completed an annual solo form for the specific role. So you should have 2 annual solo forms, which is kind of the declaration from the employer and then yourself as the GP that says, in this solo role, this is the total pensionable pay, employee contributions that were paid over, employer contributions that were paid over, etc. And there's a sort of question a bit linked to that about what do we do with those forms. So those annual solo forms, different organisations do their admin at different times, but they will normally be completed shortly or relatively shortly after the end of the pension year. So 24-25, most organisations would complete the annual solo forms kind of April, May, June time, regardless of how quickly they completed it. If you have been provided with that, you should send that in. You should go to the Contact Us inquiry section on the PCSE website and send that annual solo form in. You can select solo as a drop down option when you get to the GP pensions options, and send that in, and PCSE will log that and then have that for reference if need be, if there are any issues reconciling your solo work. So if you do solo work and you haven't already submitted your annual solo form for 24-25, then please do that and do that through the Contact Us page and select solo. PCSE will then be able to log that against your identifiers, your GMC number, etc. And then when it comes to processing your 24-25 type 2 form, that should be more straightforward. So hopefully that helps. And then there's one more question I'm going to pick up now, and we'll come back to some more questions after the next part. But there's a question about solo and annualising. I'll get into the detail of annualising when we get onto that part of the session, but I just wanted to mention that, well, certainly talking to BMA colleagues, then our sort of information suggests that the majority of GPs that do solo work have a continuous employment contract, so even if it's only occasional sessions that they do. So if that is your circumstance, then you actually don't need to annualise, you just need to put a note on your type 2 form, you know, to state that for clarity. It may not be your circumstance, of course, but I just wanted to highlight that if it's not your circumstance, then you would need to annualise, and we'll go through that a little bit later on. Okay, so that covers off quite a few of the questions, and I know you'll do a bit of a wrap up of what's what at the end when it comes to that, so thank you.
That's right, yeah. The comms team will be reviewing all the questions that have been asked tonight, especially ones that we couldn't answer live, and we'll be making sure that we update the FAQs on the website and things like that. So I think we've now got the PCSE online demonstration. So Katrina will just be getting her screens ready. She will join us back on screen just to show us what it looks like in PCSE online for 2024-25.
I have a couple of different examples. The one that I want to start with. So I've logged into PCSE online, and I think I should just mention to begin with, there was a question about will it be the same Excel sheet as last year. So should have acknowledged at the start maybe that last year for the 23-24 forms, due to various other things that were going on, we didn't have the type 2 form available on PCSE online in time for the deadline of the 28th of February. So we did a lot of communications and kind of webinars like this that were based around the NHS pensions sort of paper-based Excel form. And then later in the year, I think it was about early June time, then the type 2 form went live retrospectively on PCSE online for people that hadn't already submitted it. We did some sessions just to run through that. I think it went live in the May time. So this year then, we've worked with all the partners, NHS Pensions, our technical partners and everybody, to make sure that we could get the type 2 form live in very good time. So NHS Pensions have published the guidance and so on their website at the start of October, and this form has been live, so you can still use the contact us route. Of course it is still available, but the focus of tonight is on the PCSE online option. It's quick and easy to do once you get used to navigating around the system, so hopefully we'll be able to help you with that. So like I say, back to PCSE online, we've logged in, we've gone to the GP pensions area. So depending on your roles, you'll see a number of different tiles, as we like to call them, or buttons as other people would call them. So we're going to click on self-assessment type 2, because that's what we're all about this evening. And we've got two buttons. So self-assessment is the one that we're going to go into to begin with. That's where we're going to actually complete the type 2 form. The listing button is really, really important. The listing button is where you will see any previous submissions, whether you've made them on PCSE online or whether perhaps you did your 23-24 on time last year, you got an email saying it was approved, so it's come through to you as an email on that case that you submitted through Contact Us, and that's saying it's approved. If you go to the listing screen, you'll see an approved 23-24 entry, if you like. So it doesn't matter whether PCSE process it for you following a paper submission through Contact Us or following a PCSE online submission, you will see them all on the listing screen. If you have submitted your form on PCSE online, maybe it was a 22-23, if a form was rejected and it was an online version, you will see the rejected status, and then obviously if it's resubmitted and then subsequently approved, you'll see it's approved. So we'll hopefully get a bit of time to have a bit of a look at that, but I want to go straight into self-assessment. And just to go through the key areas really. So we've logged in as a test GP here. All of the data is fictitious and some of it might not look all that sensible. So you can indulge your test team for that, and thanks to them for preparing it for me. But we've logged in as our test GP, so it auto-populates with things like the GMC number, and all I really need to do is select the financial year. So I think there was a question earlier on, and I do know exactly the scenario. I think it's linked to what I've just said about if you'd submitted 23-24 as a paper form through Contact Us. When you go to this drop down, 23-24 would still be red in that scenario. Now, that doesn't mean that PCSE haven't processed your paper form. It just means that you haven't submitted an online version for that year. So don't worry about that is the first point. And the second point is if you go to the listing screen by clicking that other button in the type 2 area and just click on search, you'll see all of the forms that have been processed for you. So hopefully that explains that. The red bit, yes, it does say it can still be completed on PCSE Online, but it doesn't say it hasn't been completed or processed at all. So what we're going to do here is just select our 24-25. This particular GP has just started in, the territory of being a practitioner qualified for the qualified GP in 24-25. So they have one practice that they worked at. So we're going to start with a straightforward example. What I should say really is that the practice, because our record in PCSE Online as a GP is linked to the practice, everything's gone through okay from that point of view. So what will have happened is when I first started, I will have gone to the performer section on PCSE Online and completed the employment change really to say I've started at Yalding from whatever date I started at. The current process for that is I'm a salary GP, so the practice needs to then log in and confirm that, so they're approving that I've given the right information. When they've done that, then the next thing the practice needs to do is to do a pensions joiner to trigger pension deductions from their practice for me as a salary GP. So the practice does that. They go in and enter the estimated income and the tier rate that they expect me to be on, or that I expect to be on, and that's what triggers the monthly contributions that we see in the employee contribution statement. So the video that Debbie had put up there that went through the detail of the employee contribution statement, that explained that those contributions are there as a result of the practice estimate. But when a GP first joins a practice, in that first year, the contributions get created as a result of a pensions joiner form being submitted, and it's all instant, so the moment the practice goes in and says, estimated income of whatever, tier rate of whatever, then from the next month's practice contractual payment, those deductions will start to show for the new GP. And if the practice is maybe completing this 2 or 3 months or 5 or 6 months down the line, then in that first month they will have deductions for the arrears, so for the months that the GP has worked up to date. So as long as as a GP you've completed that first part and made sure that you've registered yourself on PCSE Online against that practice, the practice has gone in and approved that and then done the pensions joiner, your type 2 form should really be straightforward. If you don't see practices that you do work at here, then I think the other video sort of pointed out it's very possible that you've got to go back a few stages to see if you've been properly joined to the practice at all. So let's carry on with the type 2 form then. So we can see that we've got the practice that we're expecting. A particular GP has no approved leave in the year 24-25, but if they had been on any maternity, paternity, adoption or sick leave, you would tick yes to that. And what happens when we tick yes is that when we go up to the tabs, when we go to the tabs that appear down the left hand side, then there'll be an additional tab to complete for the authorised leave section. And all you're really doing there is completing what your actual pay was, which you will have already completed in the pay details tab. But then if you've been on reduced pay, and not everybody is on reduced pay when they've been on approved leave, are they? So it might very well be that you were on full pay the full time, so the figures in the two columns would be exactly the same. But if you have been on reduced pay, your reduced pay will be your actual pay, but then in the other column you'll be stating the pay that you would have been on had you not had that period of approved leave. So that's the relevance there. So if you've been on approved leave, you need to tick yes, and you need to fill in that other tab, but it only really has an impact if somebody has actually had reduced earnings during the approved leave period. And we see lots of scenarios and lots of type 2 forms where actually the amounts in both columns are the same. So just really to explain that. So then there's a new question that's come into the forms of late. So did you have an added year's contract during 24-25? I've got to say yes or no to that. Now, if I say yes, then because the PCSE system is checking my records in the background and I haven't got an added years live contract, or I didn't have an added years live contract for 24-25, it's telling me that I can't actually move on until I select the correct option. So I select no. If I'm a GP who has had an added years contract, then of course when I select yes, it will be happy. And what will also happen is the percentage of the contract, then the percentage that the added years are deducted at through the contract will auto-populate in box H. So it's a yes or no answer, and it tells me whether I've clicked the wrong button or not. So I'm going back to clicking no because that's my scenario, and then we just go to save and next. And then our test system will eventually move us on to the next page. Test environments are always quite slow compared to the live environment, so I'm just going to make sure that I properly clicked that. Looks like I probably didn't, so there's a lesson. Just make sure you click and see the little timer thing going on. So the next thing we come to then is the pay details tab, and this is the main page. So before we talk about the tier rate, I just want to go through the columns, and some people will be on this webinar have been through similar sessions to this in the past, and some people might be looking at it for the first time. So I've already said that this particular GP, to keep things straightforward to start with, is a salaried GP at one practice, and the GP has, in the estimated income that the practice has entered for this GP, is £18,000. Now I'm going to look at the employee contribution statement in a moment just to show you, but this scenario is the GP started partway through the year. So the earnings have been £18,000 on the estimate. So that's what auto-populates in box 2. So that's the first thing. The other thing that auto-populates is this column C, box 2C, which is quite new. It was introduced by NHS Pensions for last year's form, so for 23-24. That auto-populates with the amount of employee contributions that through the PCSE systems has been deducted from the practice for May based on that estimate that they submitted. So I've already mentioned about the practice submits an estimate, then that triggers the monthly deductions to be taken from the practice payment so that pension contributions are being paid over every month for me as a GP. Clearly through payroll, I'm having deductions taken off my salary if I was a real GP, but this is the activity that goes on to deduct contributions from the practice to pay over for the GP. So this figure here auto-populates. There were reasons NHS Pensions wanted to kind of make it clear that there's two sets of figures, and we'll get on to the second one in a minute. So that's why they introduced this column. But as you can probably figure out, PCSE already have that information. We've auto-populated it. So even in the paper form, we don't really need it because we've already got it. But it's that in your online version, it will auto-populate, so you don't need to worry about it. If you take it back to the fact that this form is a self-assessment form, then the important figure really for yourself as a GP is where you end up in terms of the difference in box 2B. So we first of all need to work out what the tier rate is that I should have been on for the year. So if we take into account that we needed to annualise this income, then we're going to say that it's 6.5%, okay? And we're going to say that actually, that was my estimated income. I actually earned £22,000 as, just an example of it turned out to be a little bit more than the practice estimated. And the amount that I had deducted through payroll is the amount that I enter in box 2A. So I've got two figures to sort of look out when I'm completing the type 2 form. If I've got this kind of simple scenario of having one row, I've got my total pensionable pay, so I'll get that from a month 12 pay slip, and I'll get the contributions that have already been deducted from me, so employee contributions that I've had deducted through payroll. Again, I'll get that from a month 12 pay slip. Or I should caveat that if this is the other way around and the GP's actually left the role partway through the year, it will be the last pay slip, won't it, for the role that they worked in. So getting my employee contribution, total employee contribution figures that's been deducted from me through payroll for box 2A. And just for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm going to say that that's £1,200. So what you can see there is that box 2B has now got a figure of minus £230. And what that means is, if we are to do the calculation of 6.5% times 22,000, so let's just quickly do that. So 22,000 times 6.5%, this is done in the background in the system, but what that would be is £1,430. So that just validates that your calculation here is saying, well, through payroll I had deducted £1,200, but for one reason or another that's turned out not to be enough. So there's £230 that, you know, once I've submitted this, I will speak to the practice about to say, you know, I've underpaid and that needs to be adjusted through payroll. Equally, it could very easily be the other way around. So if I'm a GP and I've paid, let's just say that I've paid £1,600 because they were deducting me at a higher tier rate, then in that example, I would have overpaid by £170. So these three columns are my self-assessment columns, and that box 2B is what I can then look at to say, right, okay, this is what I need to sort out with the practice. I've actually overpaid in 24-25 by £170. Box 2C, when this form gets submitted, as I said, PCSE already have the data anyway, but the PCSE system does a calculation as to what's the overall contributions that should have been paid for this GP, what's been deducted through the practice in terms of the total of all the monthly deductions, and then an adjustment is played back to the practice after the form has been submitted to either collect any shortfall if the practice hasn't actually paid over enough, which would have been, you know, in some scenarios, and then or to essentially refund into the contractual payments if the practice is overpaid. But what we see at PCSE is that probably 9 times out of 10, if not more, then the figures that come in through the practice estimate and have been deducted that way, and what the GPs actually had deducted through payroll, will be, even if it's only slightly different, they will normally be different. And, you know, there can be all sorts of reasons. If there's been a slight adjustment to salary and the practice hasn't submitted a revised estimate to PCSE, you know, if there's been some additional sessions, what, you know, there's all sorts of circumstances that can cause that. So NHS Pensions introduced this fourth column so that it could be very clear that these first three columns, really, box 2B, is to be the difference for the GP, so that they know what they need to discuss, if anything, with the practice and payroll. And then, you know, the PCSE calculation is a separate calculation based on the figures that have been submitted. So I think that's overall. I realise that's quite a lot of detail, but hopefully that's answered quite a lot of the questions that we normally get when it comes to, you know, what's the relevance of all these figures. If I have any solo work, then I need to complete 3 and 4. If I've got 2 roles, as we mentioned in the other example, and we've also got the locum row as well. If I've done any locum sessions, then there would be data to complete in there. We scroll right down to the bottom, and if we had any added years, then again there will also be a calculation in row 8, but ultimately for this GP, then we are submitting that to, we're going to go to the declaration page to submit it. It does tell us at the very bottom of the screen what the calculations are that will go back to the practice, but like I say, for the salary GP, it's the calculation further up that they'll be most interested in. So if we click Save and Next, our test system should take us on to the next page. Yeah, that's fine on our network, but that's okay. So I then take into the declaration page, and as soon as I tick to confirm, once I've checked everything, it will auto-populate with today's date, and then all I need to do is submit. And then I'm just going to quickly take you to the listing screen. Once that does make its way through it, which I think it now has done. Yep, so we can see that we've now just got the print button and at the bottom, then I've clicked the search. So I click search in the listing screen. So I just go back to what we did there, go to the listing screen, click search, and we've now got this submitted form where the declaration status is declarated. Strange word, I know, but that means that it's waiting for PCSE to assess it and check that it can be approved. And if we, just to go back to what we said earlier about, people worry about when forms are partially submitted and then they go back to the type 2 screen and they say, hang on, I want to go back to that form that I started completing the other day or the other week. They select the financial year and they say, oh, hang on, it's already initiated, completed. Now that kind of makes sense when you think I have actually submitted that, but this is the message that you also get if it's just in draft. So it's something that you've even just started the details, you don't even recall saving a draft. If you see that message, all you need to do is go back to the type 2 area, click on the listing, and then if you click search, you will find it with draft status here, and all you would need to do is click on the link, open it up, and it lets you continue completing it. So that's the top tip. If you go and see that initiated description and you think, what's that all about? It will be in draft. Go to the listing screen and you'll be able to carry on. Okay, so shall we go on to some of the next slides?
So if we can have a look at calculating the correct tier rate, and then what we can do is end on some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've got the tier rate table for 24-25. Somebody has already pointed out in the chat that the annualisation calculator for 24-25 hasn't been published on the NHS Pensions website. So unfortunately, if you are a GP who has determined that you are in a scenario that you need to annualise your income, then you'll have to wait for that because the tier rates are different. I think the question was, can I just use the 23-24 one? But you can't, because the tier rates and the thresholds are different to last year. NHS Pensions colleagues have said they're just finalising that, so I don't expect it'll be very long at all until it's available. So that's the first thing. Bit more streamlined, so less tier options, so feels a bit less confusing, complicated. What it does show is that the threshold where you're on the highest tier rate is, kind of lower than it ever was. If you go back a few years, it was over 100,000, but it was 14.5, wasn't it? So looking a bit different, but as we've kind of gone through in the demo of the PCSE online, if your employee contributions for any of your roles have been paid at a tier rate that was higher than it turns out that you needed to pay at, then there's it's a refund of contributions. And if it's been underpaid, so if it's been at a lower tier rate than it turns out you should have been paying at when you take all of your roles together, then there'll be a shortfall to resolve. Okay, so that's just flashing up the NHS Pensions website. So let's go to the next one. So the section for practitioners is the section that you need to go to on NHS Pensions. This is just a very quick example of what the annualisation calculator looks like, albeit this is the 23-24 one because we haven't got the 24-25 yet. And this again is a very simple example. So this is a GP who had just a type 2 post from 1st of July, so they didn't have a practitioner post at the start of the pension year, but they started the 1st of July and they actually finished the post at the 28th of February. So the start date and the end date of the period of work and then the pensionable pay for that period go into the calculator. The calculator then makes a calculation as to what would those earnings be if the GP had worked for the full year, which takes the 42,500 for last year up to 63,837, which for the 23-24 tier rate table, that was 12.5. So it works really straightforwardly. If you've got then multiple roles, then you need to add a row for these different roles. But remember, you only need to annualise if you haven't had continuous practitioner roles for the whole period, or for the whole pension year. So if you have been salaried GP, then you switch to partner, and then you switch back to salaried, anything like that, as long as you've had roles throughout the full year, then you don't have to annualise. If you have, the main reasons would be if you're kind of starting as a practitioner for the first time. So I think there was a question earlier on about a trainee. So trainee contributions don't go through the practitioner scheme, they go through the officer scheme. So someone who has been a trainee up until, say, June, the contributions for the first part of the year will be dealt with through the officer scheme. They will start, their type 2 form. If they became a salaried GP, say from June, July, then the type 2 form needs to pick all of that up, but they would have to annualise that. Now, annualisation is only relevant if your total income for the period that you did work now was under 62,925. If it's already over 62,925, you're already on 12.5%. The only purpose of annualisation is to figure out what tier rate you should be on. But if you're already on if you work 9 months and your salary was 65,000, you're already going to be paying 12.5 regardless of what the calculator says. So just wanted to point that out. It does make it a bit easier. Okay. I know there's quite a bit of detail on solo shortfalls and how some of the locum bits impact, and I think what we will do is do a targeted webinar to cover off some of that more detailed stuff. So we'll send out a communication to kind of list out some of the key topics that we want to cover. This covers really the basics and, is especially useful for people that haven't done a type 2 form before or that haven't used PCSE online before. But I think the follow-up webinar, we'll get into some of the specifics, and we will also look at the scenario, for example, where somebody now has added years on their form. So should we just take some of the questions? Is that all right?
Absolutely. Yep. These were the kind of the main themes that were coming through. So we have one that said, if the employee contribution statement is incorrect or inaccurate, does that matter? As long as it's correct on the type 2 form, is that then okay?
So I guess it depends on what the scenario is, but if we just take our salaried GP, I think the employee contribution statement, as we said, is only going to show what's been collected from the practice so far through that estimated income process. So as I've said, it is likely to be different when we come, and so that's fine. So on your type 2 form, the important thing for PCSE is to understand what your actual pensionable pay was for those salaried roles. So that's absolutely understood that it will quite often be different. When we come to solo in particular and locum, then we'll get into the detail of that in that follow-up session.
Thank you. But another question is, there's quite a few wanting to know where they get the pensionable pay from. Is it the gross income, or do they get their figure from the P60, or is it the March pay slip? There seems to be quite a few questions around that theme as well.
So it's a tricky one, this, because obviously PCSE don't have access to GP pay slips and things like that. So I think last year we talked about, with some of our BMA colleagues, about getting a bit of a mock-up of some examples so that we can highlight where those figures are. So the total pensionable pay should be an item on a month on a pay slip. So cumulative, I think it's called, rather than total. Cumulative pensionable pay. But we'll take that away as one of the things to see if we can actually get some practical examples, and we can add that to the guidance.
Somebody works at a practice that's recently changed their name, and they can see both the names in PCSE Online for 24-25. Do they select the practice as the new name on the form?
Again, I'm going to say it depends. Sorry. So if this is a practice merger, so I'm thinking about all of the different reasons the practice will have changed its name. If it's a practice merger, then the newly merged practice is responsible for the contributions for, the GPs in, so let's just say 2 practices have merged together. In both of those practices, arrears for all the historic years, really. So if that's the scenario, then it would be the new practice that you would select, and that would be 9 times out of 10, really.
Thank you. There was a question from David. I don't know if this is like an isolated incident or if you'll know why this would be, Katrina, but instead they've got no column or box 2 line on the type 2 form.
So I'm going to guess that David might just do solo work, or at least according to PCSE's records that we've got currently, then we may just have you for solo work. If we don't have any type 2 contributions at all, so no salaried roles or solo, the type 2 form wouldn't be available for you to select, David. So if you do any out of hours, any ICB any appraisal work for NHS England under solo, then we'll have that. I think if you do work at a practice though as a salary GP as well, then it feels like one of those scenarios where it's kind of go to your performer record on PCSE online. Are you attached to that practice? Have they approved that? Is that showing as, finalised? And then if that's the case, speaking to the practice about have they actually done the pensions joiner for you? It could be a historic data issue. There's reasons that might have gone awry. But also the other thing is if you look at your employee contribution statement, are you seeing contributions for 24-25 for that practice that you're, or for a salaried role in a practice? Does it say monthly salary rather than solo? If it does, then if you submit a query to PCSE as a type 2 query, then somebody will have a look at that for you. But it could very well be that we've got you as a solo GP at the moment. So you'll have row 3 rather than row 2. It's just in the example that I showed, it was that GP only had one salaried role. So we just had row 2. The popular, if you think about the Excel version that a lot of you would have potentially filled in last year, the rows are all there regardless of whether they apply to you. So you'd have row 2, row 2, 1, row 2, 2. If our test GP had, say, 3 different salaried roles, we would have seen on screen earlier 3, row 2, row 2, 1, row 2, 2 for those 3 salaried roles. So it's dynamic. The PCSE online form is meant to be dynamic.
Lovely. Thank you, Katrina. Just conscious of time, so I am going to start making a close. Just want to thank everybody for joining this evening, taking the time out of your own personal time to learn about Type 2 forms, so it's appreciated. Like I said, Katrina has mentioned that we will be looking at some other sessions dedicated on various topics, so please do look out for invites from us. We will be getting those sorted out soon. On behalf of PCSE, I just want to say thanks for joining this evening.